Hello, and welcome to our online information session on the NEH JUSFC Fellowships for Advanced Social Science Research on Japan program. My name is Mark Silver, and I am a program officer in the Division of Research Programs at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Also on the call today is my colleague, Jacob Lusk, who is the program analyst for this program and for a number of other fellowships programs that we have here at NEH. This session is scheduled to last for 1 hour, and my presentation will take about 30 minutes, and then I'll answer questions for the remaining time. We do plan to post a recording of this session on the NEH website within about a week. I have a slide to show you the main things I'm going to cover. We'll talk about the goals of the program and its scope, who's eligible, the details of the calendar and the award amounts, the review criteria, the required application materials, and how to submit an application. You should feel free to type in your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function, and Jacob will either answer you using the Q&A function or hold the question for me to answer once I've finished with the presentation. This program is a joint activity of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Japan-US Friendship Commission, or JUSFC for short. The JUSFC is the primary funder of the program. We at the NEH run the review process and we administer the awards. The program's goals include promoting Japan studies in the United States, encouraging US-Japan scholarly exchange, and supporting the next generation of Japan scholars in the US. And in light of that last goal, we especially encourage junior scholars to apply. The program is intended to support research on modern Japanese society and political economy, Japan's international relations, and US-Japan relations. Appropriate disciplines include anthropology, economics, geography, history, international relations, linguistics, political science, psychology, and sociology. The program's designed for individual researchers with advanced Japanese language skills whose work requires Japanese sources, fieldwork, interviews, or other contact in Japanese. The awards may be held in Japan or the US or both, and may include work in other countries for comparative purposes. You should be aware that the program does not support projects focused primarily on pre-modern Japan, that is, Japan before 1868, projects focused primarily on the interpretation of literary or artistic works, or projects that lie outside the social sciences. Nor does it support projects advocating a particular program of social action or particular public policies or legislation. And we have a full list of the prohibited project types in section D6 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, a document I'll say a bit more about later, that is posted on the same page where you found the link to join this session today. Next, eligibility requirements. To be eligible to apply to the program, you must either be a US citizen, and you can be living anywhere in the world if you're a US citizen, or you have to have been living in the US for the 3 years preceding the deadline if you are a non-citizen. If you're currently enrolled in a degree program, you're not eligible to apply unless you've met all the requirements for your degree at the time of the application deadline, and you're merely awaiting the formal award of your degree. These awards cannot be used for dissertation research. There's no institutional affiliation required in order to apply. Independent scholars are entirely welcome. No advanced degree is required, although most applicants to the program have a PhD. And as I mentioned before, junior scholars are especially encouraged to apply, but applicants at all ranks are welcome. Here are the key details of the calendar and the award amounts, and I also have our funding ratio here on this slide as well. The program supports 6 to 12 months of continuous full-time work, and we do require that you're working full-time on your project during the entire award period. So if you have a teaching position, you'll probably need to arrange for leave in order to accept an award. The stipend is $5,000 per month, and the maximum award is $60,000, which would be for 12 months of work. The application deadline is April 27th, and you'll be notified of the decision that we've made on your application in the early part of December. The earliest possible start date would be January 1st of 2023, so very shortly after you get the news. And the latest possible start date is September 1st, 2024. But we do give you that rather generous window there in which to make the decision about where you're going to start your clock ticking on your award period. You want to be sure to state your proposed start date and proposed end date carefully in your application. Although you can adjust them later, the one mistake you don't want to make is to end up requesting fewer than 6 months of support. If you do that, you run the risk of disqualification. If you request more than 12 months of support, you risk confusion for sure, if not disqualification. The funding ratio in this program over the last 5 years is 11%. That is, we've funded 11% of the applications that we receive, and on average, we've received 28 applications each year and had 3 winners. This slide is on typical uses of the funds and typical products. These awards are meant to support the typical research activities of scholars in the social sciences. You can use the awards for living expenses, for course buyouts, field work, interviews, archival research, data analysis, writing and revision, or the development of digital materials, or some combination of these things. You can use the funds for travel as well, but there's no requirement that you travel while holding an award. The products that you create may be print products or digital products. You can write a book or articles, or produce a translation or a scholarly edition, or create other interpretive tools for social scientists. Here are 3 examples of recent books written with the support of this fellowship program. Saori Katada's book, Japan's New Regional Reality, was published by Columbia University Press in July of 2020. Mary Alice Haddad's book, Effective Advocacy, Lessons from East Asian Environmentalists, was published in 2021 by the MIT Press. And Yoshikuni Igarashi's book, Japan 1972, was published in 2021 by Columbia University Press. This slide is a bit text heavy, I realize, but it's an important one. These are the review criteria for the program. And these criteria are published on our website in the notice of funding opportunity. When you're writing your application, you want to be sure to keep these review criteria very much in mind and try to craft your narrative statement to address these criteria. You should also coach the people who are writing your letters of reference to do the same. I'm going to just go through these so that you have them well in mind. The first criterion is the intellectual significance of the proposed project, including its value to social science scholars, general audiences, or both. So you need to make a strong case for why your project matters, and you need to explain why it matters in terms that will be clear even to someone who is outside of your immediate field. The second criterion is the degree to which the proposed project furthers scholarly knowledge or public understanding of contemporary Japanese society or political economy, Japan's contemporary international relations, and or US-Japan relations. So you want to be sure to connect the dots here, particularly if you're an historian. You want to explain how your project helps us understand something about contemporary Japan. The third criterion is the quality or promise of quality of the applicant's work as an interpreter of the social sciences. Devote some space in your application to talking about your previous work and ask your letter writers to do that as well. Note also the phrase here, promise of quality, which is intended to level the playing field between junior scholars and scholars at later career stages. Fourth in the list of criteria is the quality of the conception, definition, organization, and description of the project and the applicant's clarity of expression. I'll underline that phrase clarity of expression here. That is extremely important. You need to write for a broad audience, again, that includes people outside your field in order to be successful in the review in this program. Number 5 is the feasibility and appropriateness of the proposed plan of work, including, when relevant, the soundness of the dissemination and access plans. The required application materials include a one-page plan of work. You should use that to detail what you're going to accomplish with the grant and on what timeline, and make sure that what you're proposing is feasible and appropriate, as the criterion says here. You should also speak in your application to your plans for eventual dissemination or publication of your results. Number 6, the likelihood that the applicant will complete the project, not necessarily during the period of performance, which is to say the period during which you're holding the grant. So you don't have to finish the whole project during the grant period. You're welcome to define a portion of the project to work on. But in that case, you should explain how you're ultimately going to finish the project. This slide shows the application materials that we require you to submit. We ask for a 3-page narrative statement, and the format to follow is explained in the notice of funding opportunity. You also should supply a 1-page plan of work, as I mentioned a moment ago, an abstract, which is limited to 1,000 characters, a 1-page bibliography, a 2-page resume, and any necessary appendices. And those are explained in detail in the notice of funding opportunity. But just to say very briefly what that's about, if you have visual materials, we allow a 1-page sample of those. Or if you're proposing a translation or a database project, you can provide us with a translation sample or a screenshot. We also ask for 2 letters of reference, and these are due after the application deadline. Your references have until May 25th to submit their letters. I should say while we're on this slide, these page limits are crucial, and the formatting instructions that we provide in the notice of funding opportunity are also extremely important. You want to be certain that you're respecting the page limits and following all our formatting instructions, because we disqualify applications that exceed the page limits or that fail to follow the format that we've prescribed. No budget is required as part of your application, and that's because the amount of the award is determined by the number of months of support that you're requesting, with the understanding, as I said before, that you will work full-time on your project during that period. So if you're requesting 12 months of support and you're offered an award, that award would be for $60,000. It's a very simple calculation based on that $5,000 per month stipend. So that's why we don't require a budget. As you're preparing your application, you should make use of the resources that we provide on the web page for the program. That's the same page where we published the link to join this session today. The most important of those resources is the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which I've already referred to several times. That document, which is available for download from the program page, is about 20 pages long, so it can look daunting, particularly if you're a first-time applicant, but that document is crucial. It provides a full description of the program and how to apply. So you certainly want to become familiar with the Notice of Funding Opportunity if you decide you're interested in applying to the program. Also on that same webpage, we have 3 samples of successful applications that you can study. And we also have a list of previously funded projects there. You should use some caution when looking at that list because the Notice of Funding Opportunity can change slightly over the years, and it has evolved slightly, including definitions of what sorts of projects are allowable or not allowable. So use some caution as you're referring to that list of older projects that we have funded. We have also an FAQ document with answers to frequently asked questions on the web page. And you should feel free to get in touch with those of us here on the staff if you have questions that aren't addressed in these materials. It is very definitely part of our job to help you put your best foot forward in the application process. So again, if you do have questions, you're welcome to get in touch with us. And I've put the program email address and phone number on the bottom of this slide. A couple of words about submitting your application. You have to submit your application through a separate website, which is called grants.gov or grants.gov. You should go ahead and register now at grants.gov if you think you're interested in submitting an application. And you'll also need to create an account at login.gov. And I have their logo at the bottom right of the screen here. And that login.gov site will issue you the login credentials that you need to access grants.gov. If you already have a grants.gov account, you should link that account to login.gov. And if you go to the grants.gov page, they have guidance there available about just how to do that. Point number 2 on the left-hand side of this slide is about creating an individual applicant profile. When you set up your grants.gov account, you should be sure to create an individual profile within the account. If you don't do this, you'll discover that the red apply button shown here on the grants.gov page that I've pasted on this slide, you're going to discover that that apply button is grayed out and it won't be functioning. So you won't be able to submit an application. If you run into that problem, go back to our notice of funding opportunity and follow the instructions for setting up an individual applicant profile. This is the #1 technical problem that people have when they're trying to submit their application. So save yourself some time and some aggravation, and look at that section in the notice of funding opportunity for instructions about how to set up an individual applicant profile. Point 3 here, submit several days early to allow time for technical problems. Grants.gov can be cumbersome, it can be confusing, so allow some extra time for the submission of your application. And you should also realize that if you haven't followed our instructions, your application might be rejected because of a format error of some kind. And so you want to allow time to correct for that kind of a problem. If you get an email back from us saying that your application has been rejected, you don't want to be getting that email very close to midnight on the day of the deadline. So I recommend that you submit the application at least 3 days ahead of the deadline, and then be alert for an email confirming that you've been assigned a tracking number by NEH. Then the 4th point here, grants.gov has a helpline available 24/7, and that's at 1-800-518-4726. They also have email support. Their email address is support@grants.gov. And that's the place that you should turn to first if you're having a technical problem with grants.gov. The people at that helpline will be far better equipped to diagnose your problem than we here at NEHR. This slide shows the steps of application review. Your application will be read in July by a panel of 4 external evaluators, all of whom will be social scientists whose research focuses on Japan. The NEH staff then makes funding recommendations based on those evaluations. And our recommendations are reviewed in turn by the National Council on the Humanities at their meeting in November. And the chair of the endowment will make the final decisions on the awards shortly after that. and you'll get the news about our decision by mid-December. That was the final slide in the presentation that I've prepared. I've put our contact information up on the screen here again. The email address is fellowships@neh.gov, and our phone number is 202-606-8200. If you do call and leave a message, I suggest that you leave an email address as well in your message. That will help us get back to you more quickly. But now we have time for questions, and I'll turn to Jacob and ask whether we have some questions that have come in that I might try to address.
Yeah, we've actually got a few really good questions that I think everyone would benefit from. So the first one is it possible to take 6 months of funding non-continuously, or should the award be continuous?
We require that your award period be continuous. So we don't allow you to take a break partway through the award period and then resume the period later. So you do need to be able to commit at least 6 full-time continuous months to the project in order to hold one of these awards. If you're not able to do that, you might consider applying to NEH's Summer Stipends program, which provides 2 months of support. It's a stipend of $6,000 for that 2-month period, and you don't actually have to use it during the summer, in spite of that name, Summer Stipends. And that program does not have a focus particularly on Japan, and it doesn't have a focus particularly on the social sciences either. It's a humanities program, but in some cases there would be sufficient overlap between the humanities and the social sciences so that you might consider investigating that option.
The next question is, I'm sorry. The next question is, if we ask for 12 months of support, is it possible that we will receive fewer months of support than what we've asked for?
Good question, and the answer is no. We don't pare down proposed award periods when we make an offer. So we'll either give you the full amount that you've requested, or we'll give you a rejection notice. There's not any in between there. So that means that you need to be thoughtful and realistic as you're mapping out your award period and as you're presenting the work plan for the award period in your application. So you want to be sure that if you're, whatever the number of months of support that you're asking for, that you are presenting a work plan that looks like it will in fact occupy you for that amount of time. And it should, in addition to being feasible to accomplish in that period of time. So that gets back to that phrase, feasible and appropriate, or the feasibility and appropriateness of the work plan. The phrase that appears in the review criteria that we looked at together.
And are applicants likely to receive an award if they ask for a shorter period of time?
That's a natural next question, and the answer is no. So you should not try to shorten your requested period with the idea that that's going to make the project look more attractive to us because it will cost less money. So we're not bargain hunting in that sense. You should think about what you need and ask for what you need. And if it's 12 months of support, that's fine. We're not going to say, well, this other person only asked for 11 months and that would be cheaper, so we'll give the preference to the cheaper project. We're looking at the project based on those criteria, those evaluation criteria that I presented.
These pieces to the, we have a question about projects at different stages of development. Could you say a little bit about how we might evaluate projects that are in earlier stages, or versus ones that are, asking for time to complete the manuscript?
Yeah, that's a good question. As a matter of policy, we fund projects at any stage. So you could be at an early stage in the project, you could be at a later stage in the project. That said, it's true, often evaluators will be somewhat more attracted by a project that seems closer to completion, simply because more elements are in place, the project seems more sort of tangible. There often are fewer questions about how some element of the research program is going to go, simply because more has been accomplished already. But we don't want the evaluators just to have a sort of implicit preference for projects that are further along on the timeline. And we remind them that we're open to funding projects at any stage, early or late, when we're preparing them for the review panel meeting. If you are at an earlier stage in your project, what you should really be very careful about is that the conception of it is as clear as you can possibly make it. So you may be early in the research phase still, and you may be somewhat unsure about what your conclusions are going to be. But you need to provide a very clear set of guiding principles, a clear research question or questions that you're trying to answer. And if possible, think about projecting some possible conclusions. And then to talk also about the significance of those possible conclusions. So if you're at an early stage, I would encourage you to take all the more seriously that first criterion about the intellectual significance of the project, and really wrestle with that and give the evaluators as much as you possibly can on likely results, likely significance of the project, even though it may feel that that is still some distance in the future, that will be truly settled for you. Because you need to persuade people that you do have a plan and a framework that's going to help you get through the research period that you're proposing, and that you won't be sort of floundering somehow partway through that period of funded time.
We have a question who the panelists are for this program. Do we recruit social scientists? Do we recruit scholars who specialize in Japan?
We do indeed. We use 4 reviewers, and all 4 of them are social scientists who have an explicit Japan focus. So the references that I made to writing for a broad audience for people who are not necessarily in your immediate field would come into play kind of in 2 ways. In one, I mean, the first way has to do with the review panel itself. Obviously, the social sciences is a very broad umbrella. And if you're working in cultural anthropology, you need to be sure that you're writing in such a way that someone who specializes in international relations, say, will be able to understand the significance of your project. So there may be someone who is a specialist of the international relations of Japan who is sitting on the panel, and you don't want to somehow alienate that person with specialized jargon having to do with the field of cultural anthropology. And I've seen that happen, even though it's one Japan specialist speaking to another. So bear that in mind. Then the second thing that comes into play, if you remember the stair steps that I had on the slide showing the review process, it is a multi-stage review process. And once the staff has made recommendations for funding, those recommendations are reviewed by people who may not be, and in fact likely are not, social scientists specializing in Japan. So if there's a question about the recommendation that we've made and the application is looked at closely by one of the people on the National Council of the Humanities or by someone in the office of the chair, you need to be sure that they're not faced with some kind of specialized jargon, again, that leaves them puzzled about what the significance of the project is.
So Mark, we have a question about the encouragement for junior scholars. Is there, the question is essentially, are senior scholars disadvantaged in their review process? Or do junior scholars receive preference?
No. So we are not giving preference to junior scholars in the sense of boosting an inferior application from a junior scholar simply because that person is a junior scholar. The idea is that by encouraging junior scholars, that we'll get more applications from junior scholars, thus increasing the chances that at the end of the process, a junior scholar ends up with one or more of our awards. And I guess I'd add that because we have this encouragement in place, our reviewers are aware of it. And if there were a case where it was really dead even between two applications, that they would consider the possibility of giving the nod to the junior scholar. But it seldom, if ever, happens that two applications really are sort of dead even somehow on all the 5 criteria that I mentioned.
Could you speak to who applicants should choose to write their letters of recommendation?
Sure, that's another great question. Really the primary consideration in soliciting these letters would be choosing people who know your work well and who will devote time to writing the letter, and above all, will include a nice paragraph in that letter on the intellectual significance of your proposed project. So what you don't want is someone who's going to use a letter perhaps that they've written for you already with very little modification. In other words, it's not up to date in terms of what you're currently proposing. We sometimes see letters of recommendation that may go on for several pages praising the person's work and their previous work, and then they end up being a bit of a letdown because you get to where you expect the crucial paragraph and the letter writer has said something like, "And I'm sure this project will be just as good." And that doesn't quite satisfy our evaluators who are looking for another voice speaking to the intellectual significance of the proposed project. So that would be my first consideration, choosing people who will take the time to write a letter that really does speak to your proposal, the proposal that the evaluators are reading. Second, you should consider asking people outside your own institution. I would encourage you to ask people outside your own institution for letters because you want to be looking for people who really can speak with some authority as well to the significance of your project. And it's possible that one of the best possible people to speak to the significance of your project is also at your own institution. And in that case, that could well be the way to go, but that would be unusual. And in this competition, whether you're a good colleague in the department, whether your teaching is effective, these are very low down on the list of considerations, and you, in fact, they're not included in the list of criteria that I mentioned at all. So those would be things that sometimes would lead someone to think they should get a letter from someone at their own institution, but they're not really relevant in this case. And in fact, I think the more important consideration is, do you convey the impression to our evaluators that your work is interesting to people who are outside your own institution? Have you developed a following of some kind, or at least an ally? Do you have an ally or two who do find your work interesting and significant, who are not coming to your work from the point of view of say a dissertation advisor or a colleague at your own institution? So that raises a question of, should you ask your dissertation advisor for a letter? If you're a junior scholar, I see no problem with that. I don't think our evaluators tend to. And it's probably natural, in fact, to go to your dissertation advisor for one of your letters. Then for the second one, I would think again about trying to go further afield for that letter. If you're not a junior scholar, then I would hesitate before asking for a letter from a dissertation advisor. So once you get to the point where you're, if you're 7 years or more from your PhD, then I think it starts to become, with each additional year beyond the 7, it becomes, you're starting to run a little bit greater risk that people will wonder why you've gone back to your dissertation advisor for a letter. So for people beyond that 7-year period, since they've earned their PhD, I would suggest that you look elsewhere, that you look to someone apart from your dissertation advisor for a letter if possible.
We a couple questions left, so I just want to encourage anyone who has any remaining questions to submit if we haven't covered anything that you're wondering about. We have a question about the award funds, how they're paid out, and how the recipient can use them.
Mm-hmm. So if we make an offer to you, you will have a choice. You'll have the option of having the funds paid into your personal account or into an institutional account, and we're happy to follow either course. Some people like to have the money paid into their institutional account simply because they can then have deductions for health insurance premiums or retirement contributions taken out quite easily without interruption, and the funds are in a sense functioning as salary replacement, and that's fine. We pay the money out quarterly. Generally, if you have a 12-month fellowship, there'd be a payment every 3 months. But we have some flexibility there. If you need some other kind of payment arrangement, we could work with you on that. The other part of the question was, what can you use the money for? You can use the money for just about anything that would support your research project. You can use it to pay for your own living expenses. You can use it for course buyouts. You can use it for travel, but as I said, there's no requirement that you travel during the research period. You can use it to obtain research services or assistance of some kind. I'll come back to that statement I began with, that as long as what you're doing is supporting your research project, it's unlikely that we will object to that particular use of the money. And we don't require a budget as part of your application materials. In other words, you need not specify when you're applying to us exactly how you're going to use the money. And you shouldn't take up precious space in your application telling us, that you need $1,600 for a plane ticket to Japan and you're going to stay in this or that hotel or something like that, because the space is just too precious in those few pages that we give you to make the case for your application and to speak to those evaluation criteria that I had up on the screen.
We have another question. Japanese language skills. Do we require any proof of language skills, and will panelists be looking for it somewhere in the application?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't actually require that you have Japanese language skills in order to apply to this program. And it's not inconceivable that somebody could have a project that would be feasible relying on translation or some such thing. I think it would be very difficult to persuade the evaluators that that would be possible with most projects. And the reality is that nearly every application comes from someone who does have advanced Japanese language skills. We don't require you to submit a proficiency test result or something like that in your application materials. Generally, what we're doing is looking at your education, your training, and your previous work, the extent to which that's relied on Japanese language knowledge or skills. And if there's so are the evaluators looking for that in the evaluation material, or rather in the application materials? They are trying to judge the feasibility of your work plan. And if Japanese language use or knowledge seems to them to be an important part of pulling off the project successfully, then that will certainly come into the evaluation of the application. So I would recommend that you include mention of your language competency on your CV. And in fact, I think there's a prompt for that in our instructions. So you should list your level of competence in Japanese. And then in your bibliography for the project, I would also think about signaling knowledge or awareness of scholarship that's been done in Japanese by including, assuming they would be relevant, references that were published in Japanese as part of your bibliography. If you do that, you should also translate the title of whatever work or works you're citing into English so that people who don't know Japanese will have some idea of what that thing in your bibliography is about. But you're certainly welcome to list Japanese works in your bibliography, and your bibliography will certainly be assessed by the evaluators from every angle. I mean, not only in terms of Japanese language knowledge or awareness of Japanese scholarship that might be relevant to your project, but also in terms of assessing your overall approach and your grounding in the field.
Thanks, Mark. Those are all the questions we've received during the webinar, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jacob, and thank you to those of you in the audience for attending today. And I'll just underline again that if you have additional questions that occur to you or that we didn't address fully here today, you're welcome to get in touch with us. You can write to us at fellowships@neh.gov or call at 202-606-8200, and we'll try to address your questions. Thank you again, everybody. Bye-bye.